My name is Felicia Jadzak. I am your facilitator for today. I'm also the co-founder and partner at Inclusion Geeks. We are an organization whose mission it is to help make workplaces work for everyone. We do this by providing consulting, coaching, training, workshops, webinars, a whole lot of support for folks to help think about how to move the needle towards greater inclusivity. I am based in Western Massachusetts, and I am joining you today from the traditional lands of the Nipmuc and Pocumtuck peoples. If anyone cannot see me, I am actually wearing the exact same outfit that is in my profile picture, which I just realized right now. But I am a short, curly-haired, brown wearing woman and a brown woman wearing a brown sweater and some earrings as well. But very excited to be here with all of you today as we get into this discussion. I use she, her pronouns, and we will get to know each other a little bit more as we go through today's webinar. But let's talk about what we're doing and how you can all engage. So the chat has already been utilized quite a bit, which is great. Please feel free to continue using that throughout today's webinar. I have a colleague on the chat as well, Rachel Murray, so please feel free to also message Rachel if you have any tech issues in particular. I will be trying to keep an eye on the chat, but sometimes it flies by pretty quickly. So if you have a question or a comment that you would like to share that is a bit more private or personal, you are always welcome to send us a private message. We won't share your name out if you have a question or comment. And if I'm in the middle of talking and you have a burning question that you'd like addressed in the moment, please feel free to address it to my colleague Rachel. So, as we get into our session for today, there's also a couple other ways that you can engage with us beyond chat, which I put up here on the slide. But I'd like to start us off before we even get into the topic by sharing and observing a quick moment of silence because we are dealing with a lot in this world, which is the understatement of the year. But I do want to acknowledge that as of last night, we had the really tragic American Airlines crash that happened in the DC area, and there were 60 plus, I think at least 63, 67 folks who tragically lost their lives. And so I'd like to just acknowledge that before we get into today's webinar. So if you are willing to join me, please share in a moment of silence. All right, thank you so much for joining me with that. Switching gears, let us start by talking about accountability. And I'm going to start off with an opening question. And for anyone who's taken one of our webinars before, you know that we love some opening questions to get you all engaged as well. While I will be talking a lot today, we also want to get your voices and your questions in the virtual room. So my opening question for you all to start us off with is what is accountability and what does accountability mean to you? Now, just as a caveat, I do know or I have some thoughts to share on these two questions, but I'd love to start off with what your thoughts are. And so I've just put up a Slido on the screen. And if anyone's unfamiliar with this tool, it is an interactive, real-time tool where you can share your thoughts and your words and phrases. So the best way to access it is by going to that QR code with whatever device you have on you. If that's not working for you or if that's not accessible for you right now, you can also go directly to slido.com and you can use the code 4263109. So please go ahead and share once you have a chance to get in there. And if for some reason it's not working at all because technology sometimes does not cooperate with us, even on the best of days, you're always welcome to share in chat publicly or privately as well. So you have a lot of options ready for you. But I see that there are some comments coming through, so please feel free to go ahead. And as we get them in, I'll start to call out some of what we have on the screen here. So the question is, what is accountability? What does accountability mean to you? So we've got commitment, follow through, integrity in action, responsibility, doing what you say you're going to do, consistency, collective effort. One thing I love about Slido is that the more people who share the same phrase or the same wording or similar wording, the bigger the words get. So we see quite clearly here that responsibility, ownership are coming through loud and clear from all of you. Let's see what else we have in here. Taking responsibility, the ability to recognize, to grow, consistency, ownership, follow through, responsibility. Some key big phrases here. So let's take another maybe 30 seconds. And I see that there's at least one or two people who are still typing away. So please feel free to continue and get those words and phrases in here. I also see self-awareness, collective effort, and I'm going to take a quick look at the chat and just make sure there's nothing in here. And I don't see any immediate phrases or words, although I know some of you have shared as you signed in terms of how you're thinking about accountability. So responsibility is coming through. Accountability equals growth. A lot of good stuff there. All right, so we can probably do this all day, but we don't have time to do this all day. So if you're still typing away, please feel free to do so. But I think we're at a good point here. So what I'd love to do is tell you a little bit about how I'm thinking and defining accountability. So I'm going to start off with a definition, which is corporate accountability. And this one is a definition that many folks, ranging from leaders to individuals, have struggled with, in all honesty, especially in a workplace setting. Because depending on context, there might be different definitions. And so this is just a starting point for us. It's not going to be my ending point, but it's my starting point. So, for example, at an organizational level, corporate accountability is referring to areas that have to do with a non-financial commitment of a public company, such as how does it handle areas such as social responsibility, sustainability, corporate governance. And this definition is based on the premise that a company must be accountable to its employees and its community members, as well as making a profit for shareholders. Companies should be held responsible for the impact of their actions on society and the environment. So already there are some of those words that we just saw in that slide of responsibility, community, things like that. Now, the kind of accountability that I really want to talk about for today is sort of related to this idea, but it's taking a bit more of a granular view. And we're going to drill down a little bit more into both the individual level and interpersonal levels, the relationships that exist between team members in a workplace corporate setting, and how we actually work together. So, this is the definition that you're really familiar with, or if this feels good to you, that's totally fine. This is one definition. And the definition that I'm going to take us to in just a moment is another version of this. But this is a good place for us to start because it's a very commonly held idea of accountability. Now, let's switch into accountability and digging in a little bit deeper. So, if we switch to a different version, a different definition, we're thinking of this idea of accountability that's involving accepting responsibility for our actions, which echoes what we've all shared so far, taking ownership of our work duties, acknowledging our mistakes, and taking action to fix them. But I want to talk about specifically inclusive accountability, and that's really a topic that I'm going to talk about the most today. So, the way that I'm thinking about inclusive accountability is that everyone in an organization, and it doesn't matter whether you're coming from a higher ed organization, a nonprofit, a for-profit, a startup, whatever your organizational structure is, everyone is responsible to a certain degree for creating and sustaining an inclusive environment where everyone feels valued, respected, and we're also actively addressing and correcting behaviors that might undermine inclusivity. So, this is where we're really thinking about there's that ownership piece. It's not just about making mistakes and saying, oh, sorry, it's 5 p.m. and I'm logging off now, so over to you. It's about owning your part in creating this environment at your workplace, fixing any issues, and taking that responsibility. Now, again, how this actually shows up is going to look a little bit different for each of us here on this call today. And it'll depend on what kind of job you're working, or what kind of organization or industry you're working in. But the overall takeaway that I want us to keep right now is that one, accountability is critical. And two, it's everyone's job to really get into this concept of accountability. Now, at this point, why do we care? Well, there's a lot of reasons why accountability is important. And if you have additional thoughts as I'm going through this, please feel free to share them in the chat. But first, this is going to allow us as an organization, as a team, as a group of people to build trust and build a culture of ownership. Now, you might notice that I've starred trust here, and that's because I'm going to dig into the idea of trust a little bit deeper in just a moment. But that's where we're going to start from. We want to have a concept, not just a concept, a culture of trust and shared ownership. We're also thinking about how can we improve not just performance, but morale. And that's a big one because it's not just about executing on our actions. It's about how do we feel when we're at work? How are we working with each other? As we've learned over the last several years with all the different shifts in how we work and what the workplace culture looks like, we've learned that this is very important for folks when we're working in community. And when you and your employees or you and your colleagues are taking responsibility for your work, you're developing that sense of ownership and you're going to become more invested in your projects and in your output. Everyone wants to put out, hopefully, the best quality work possible. And so when people feel valued and respected, that does tend to lead to higher job satisfaction and productivity. It's also a measurement of progress. And so employees who feel accountable for their work tend to gain skills to measure how they're progressing in their work while they're overall working towards improvement. And when we understand how what we do impacts the whole team, then we are able to further develop our skills and make further progress. We're also going to have a greater degree of confidence because, again, a lot of this has to do with forming trust in the workplace. And so employees will feel more confident in work when we know that we have a team around us to support them, whether that's a manager, colleagues, people who report to us, senior leadership, whoever that might be. This also improves connections with each other. And so this is where we are building lasting relationships where we can go back and forth with our colleagues. And it boosts innovation and creativity. So if we have a wide range of different perspectives, that's more likely to generate creative solutions to complex problems. That's something that we've learned over and over again in the research. So I don't think I have to explain to you or convince you of all these reasons, but this is just an overview of why it's important. But I do want to drill down into trust a little bit more because that's what I tend to call a squishy concept. We talk a lot about concepts like trust, like accountability, but we don't always really get into what does it actually mean and how do we think about it. So, how I'm defining trust is using a definition that's taken from Deloitte's Global Human Capital Trends Report from 2024. That report was based on over 400,000 different survey responses with customers, workers, employees over nearly, I think, 500 different brands. There were focus groups, conversations with leaders, case studies, a lot of different research that Deloitte pulled together. And what they're doing is they're really defining trust for us. And so I really like this definition for us to start off with. I'll read it out in case anyone is not able to see the screen. Trust is a belief that the other party won't cause harm. And by the way, I'll mention as a side note, the emphasis here are mine, not Deloitte's. Believe that the other party won't cause harm, that we can rely on another to act in a way that is beneficial, honest, fair, and reliable. At its heart, trust involves a willingness to be vulnerable and to depend on others for mutual cooperation and benefit. It's a belief that we will act in each other's best interest. But to be mutually vulnerable, people typically need to feel empathy and psychological safety. And I think that's really important because we don't always think about psychological safety, empathy, these kinds of ideas and concepts when we're talking about work or how do we work with each other? How are we accountable to each other? And so I really like that inclusion of how we're thinking about trust because in my mind, those factors are really critical to this overall conversation. Now, Deloitte is distilling trust down to four different factors. The first one is humanity. So this basically entails demonstrating that idea of empathy, kindness, treating people fairly. We're all human beings together. Second factor is capability. This has to do with creating quality, fill in the blank. It could be an experience, a product, a service, whatever your deliverables are. You're capable of creating that and putting that out there. The third quality, or the third factor rather, is reliability. And this is around consistently delivering on your promises and your expectations and experiences. The final factor is transparency. And this has to do with openly sharing information, motives, actions in straightforward, plain, clear language. It has to do with clear communication. And the reason why I'm sharing this and why I do like trust more than talking about things like how engaged are we or how much our employees bought in is because engagement, if we're talking about employee engagement in particular, is really about how much is a given employee, a certain person, how much are they willing to extend themselves on behalf of the organization? But trust is actually about are our employees getting what they need from the organization? And can we or can our employees rely on the organization to support our best interests? So trust is really about this two-way street. And in today's workplace, in a lot of organizations, sometimes we find that trust has been broken on both sides. And so there's been promises made that maybe we're not always kept, or we're shifting really, really rapidly. So if we're getting back to accountability, it's not about attacking or blaming each other. It's about getting in alignment. How do we get our work done? And how do we do it in a way that feels really good to everybody? So, with all this in mind, I have another question for all of you. So, this question is, can you think of any examples of accountability in the workplace, given what we've just talked about so far with our definitions of accountability and digging a little bit deeper into this idea of trust? Now, don't worry, I have some examples as well that are ready and waiting to show you, but I'd love to start off with what your thoughts are. And if you're thinking to yourself, I don't have any examples. That's why I'm here in this webinar, Felicia. That's totally fine too. Feel free to put a big question mark in the Slido, or you can put it in the chat as well. That's totally valid and fair. But I'll take a minute or two to see what folks have as far as examples of accountability. And once again, if the Slido isn't working for you, please feel free to utilize the chat. All right, so I see some stuff is starting to come in here. So, examples of accountability in the workplace. Apologizing when communication fails. Yeah, that one, it's interesting. And I know there's more people who are typing in, but I'm just going to respond to this first one because a lot of times apologizing ends up being really, really hard for people. And if that's true for you, feel free to put an emoji reaction or a plus or a one in the chat. But I can tell you firsthand, apologizing is one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, especially in the workplace context. I'd rather apologize to my friends and family than apologize at work because it has a different way of coming across. It's actually really hard. So thank you to that person who started this off with that. All right, we got a lot more stuff coming through, so I'm going to start reading this out so people can see what we have here. So we've got the apologizing one, we've got owning mistakes, leaders acknowledging when they made a misstep and outlining what they're going to do differently in the future. I love that one because it's not just about saying, hey, I made a mistake. Sorry. I mean, that's an apology in and of itself. So I guess that's better than not having any kind of apology. But that second piece around what are we going to do differently in the future is key because that's about how you really get to that repairing the harm as opposed to just saying, I made a mistake, which doesn't always get at that inclusive accountability that we're really looking for. Naming issues, explaining pivots, that has to do with our clear communication. Absolutely. Owning your mistakes, what you've learned from it, taking ownership, team members following up on discrepancies or new information. Yeah, we're living in a very rapidly shifting world right now, and things change. And that might mean that we might make a mistake that wasn't even something that we had any awareness of, that was a possibility when we first started doing the work on whatever it is, the project, the email, the press release, whatever we're thinking about. Postmortems with improvements acted on, changing our strategy based on staff feedback, not just working in an echo chamber. When a supervisor stands up for their employees, I love that one. Giving credit to all team members, owning your mistakes, making a plan to make sure it doesn't happen again, admitting or owning when you don't know something. Again, I love this one. Thank you for whoever shared this because this is also really, really hard. And I will share with you all that in the very beginning of my career as a young person right out of college, one of the best lessons I was ever taught was by one of my first bosses when I started working, who said, "There are no dumb questions." And if you work for, I think his point was, if you work on something for more than an hour, then you need to come to me and tell me that you're not sure what's happening or you don't know what's going on because you're just going to start spinning your wheels. And it's better to admit that you don't know something versus pretend that you do because that will lead us down a path we don't want to be down. Let's see what else we have here. Remembering the goals, speaking up when microaggressions occur, reporting out the results from surveys. And I see in the chat there's a question, can this list be shared after? Absolutely. That's the beauty of Slido. So we will have this list. We can absolutely share this out afterwards once we finish this webinar. So we will report out our own results from our own internal survey that we're doing right here. Actually changing things based on feedback instead of just letting it go into the void. Being honest about boundaries. Yes, boundaries are so important, especially with regards to communication. Not letting our ego get in the way when we make mistakes and taking responsibility. Ego is tricky because sometimes we don't want to admit we made a mistake. We're less than perfect. Guess what? We're human beings. No one is perfect. We're all going to make a mistake at some point. Owning our impact when it's harmful, even if the intention was not. Yes. So I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with this phrase, but we talk a lot in our work at Inclusion Geeks around intent versus impact. And I think that's very much represented in this statement here. So the way that I always like to think about it from a really brief standpoint is I do think it's important to recognize intent because someone could have ill intention. So I do want to recognize that. But I'm addressing the impact that we have or that we have on each other. And so that's a really important one to include in there. All right, I think that's it. I don't see anyone else typing right now. So that's our list. So this is great. So these are some great examples of accountability in the workplace. What I'm going to do is go through some examples from a couple different levels. So I'm going to start us off with an individual accountability level for examples, then I'll go into managerial, and then I'll look at organizational examples. So because I know we have a lot of folks on this call today who are in different stages of your career or your leadership or your roles. Hopefully, there's some examples here for everyone. And as I go through these examples, if I miss anything, add it into the chat because I'm also human. I'm not going to be perfect. And I know that in advance. So please feel free to share in chat if there's something that you see or that you don't see, rather. All right, so let's start us off with some individual accountability examples. Now, what can accountability in the workplace on a personal level look like for us? So, first, we can look at meeting performance expectations. So, again, what's your job role? What are you hired to do? Are you actually doing it? Take responsibility for action. And this phrase has been shared a lot already in our webinar. So this has to do with everything we've been sharing and hearing so far. Owning our mistakes, taking responsibility, admitting it when we make an error, apologizing when necessary, taking steps to address and rectify the situation. We've got communicate. So communicate and seek feedback. This can be proactively asking for constructive criticism to help improve our performance, not just waiting for someone to tell us if we're doing well or not well. So, about really taking ownership of our own career and our own actions as well. On this bottom level here, we've got following through on commitments. Now, this is really about just keeping our promises, making sure that if we committed to a colleague, a client, a manager, a direct report, that we're actually following through on it and we're not just saying. It's about the action piece as well as the speaking piece. Staying prepared. So that can look in a lot of different ways for folks, but it could look like arriving on time to a meeting or to work. It could be being prepared for meetings. It could be being ready to contribute in a meaningful way and not just signing on to a Zoom or a Microsoft Teams call and kind of zoning out, but really being engaged. And then finally, meeting deadlines. So getting our stuff done on time without requiring constant reminders. Now, for a lot of you, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, Felicia, these are really basic. And yes, they are really basic, but we have to start somewhere because building in accountability is a lot about just doing what we say we're going to do and owning it and owning up to it. And so these are a couple ways to start us off. If we're looking at the managerial level, here's some examples. So set clear expectations. This is one that I have found in my work, both on a personal level, so as a manager, and in my work with clients. This is a really, really tricky one. So it sounds simple on the surface, but it's actually hard in practice because sometimes we think we are doing certain things, but we're actually not being clear. We're not being specific. We're not defining what is someone's role? What is someone's goals? What are the expectations for a team member or a team? Providing resources and tools. So this is making sure that everyone has the tools and the support that they need to succeed. It means if you're asking someone to complete a big project, you give them time, budget, resources, people, whatever it is that that means, and not setting someone up to fail. Recognize effort and reward employees. We definitely tend to have negativity bias at work. I know I'm guilty of this too. And what I mean by that is we sometimes just fixate on what goes wrong, or if we messed up, or if we missed a deadline, and we don't always actually take time to celebrate the wins. even the small wins. It could be, for me, I know on a personal level, I'm like, I got up and I stretched this morning. That is a big win for me, even though it has nothing to do with my work, but it actually does have a lot to do with my work because I'm setting a commitment for myself, I'm following through on it, and it's going to impact my whole day. So acknowledging and rewarding. Now, I can't necessarily reward myself as my own employee, but I can give myself a little pat on the back or a little mental thumbs up. But if I'm working with a team member, I can put a positive message on Slack. I can send them a gift card. I can write an email to the team and say, so and so did a great job on this client report. There are a lot of different ways that you can do this to acknowledge in a workplace setting. If there are performance or behavioral issues, deal with them really promptly and fairly because a lot of times what we also find is that when this kind of stuff bubbles up as managers, sometimes we are too busy. It's something we don't really want to deal with, so we might avoid it. And that just festers and it doesn't really lean into us taking accountability from a role perspective. Regular check-ins. It sounds simple, but guess what? Not everyone does this. And I'm sure some of you might be on this call thinking to yourself, yep, my manager doesn't do this, or I don't do this for whatever reasons. If we have regular check-ins, if we schedule progress reviews, whether it's for a project or a direct report or a team in general, that's going to make sure that everyone is aligned and on track. And then finally, for managers and leaders really as well, lead by example. So if we can model how we are taking accountability, how we are taking ownership, how we say, yes, I messed up on this, or I misunderstood, or I changed my mind, that is so powerful because that not only makes sure that we are adhering to the same standards that we're asking of our employees, but it's also showing people what it looks like, what it feels like, what it can sound like, or just, what that process entails for folks who may not necessarily have experienced that before. Now, finally, on the organizational level, here's a couple other thoughts too. Now, you'll notice there's some overlap here as well. So I'll go through these relatively quickly. But at an organizational level, transparent communication to a certain extent. So that can be sharing company goals, challenges, progress openly with employees. I'll take a brief note here that it is the end of January 2025, and there's been a lot of change this month. So, transparent communications around things that might be impacting your team, your employees, your company, your organization, and just being open about it. Sometimes it's powerful even to say, I'm not sure what's happening, but just know we're working on it, or we're thinking about it, or we're addressing it, or uh, we have this on our minds to keep tabs on, whatever that might look like for you. Measure outcomes. That's around tracking key performance indicators, those KPIs, holding your departments, holding your managers, holding your leaders accountable for results. Commit to your values. So if you have values in place at an organizational level, make sure that your policies, your actions, your procedures are reflecting your organization's mission and values and that they're not just out there on their own. Correcting course. So we're going to make mistakes at the organizational level too. It's going to happen because guess what? Organizations are made up of people. So if and when we make a mistake at an organizational level, we're going to take responsibility for that. So that could be a failed product launch. It could be a PR issue. It could be something, who knows what in today's world, but if something happens, addressing it and not just trying to hide it or brush over it. Feedback mechanisms, and I think I saw this in the chat as well. So providing feedback mechanisms, really important. So giving your employees different avenues in which they can share concerns, also establishing your follow-up actions so that again, you're demonstrating accountability. So this could be having a pulse survey, it could be having an employee engagement survey, but it could also be not just relying on those two tools only. It could be having an anonymous channel if you use a tool like Slack or Microsoft Teams. It could be setting up HR contacts. There's all different ways that we can think about feedback and how we get it. If you work in an in-person office or an in-person location, it can be the traditional box with comments that you can put in there and write anonymously. So there's tons of different ways to think about how you can get feedback, but it's about soliciting it in different ways and then actually looking at it, reading through it, and acting on it. And then finally, support each other. So a lot of times when we're struggling, we think we have to go through things on our own. at an organizational level, how can we provide help? How can we provide support to the team so that the team is succeeding collectively? And this takes a little bit of a different mindset, moving from an individualistic mindset to a collective mindset. So, just a couple examples here. And some of these are high level, some of them are not. But if there's anything else that you would add to these lists, example wise, let me know in the chat. But I want to move now into strategies for building accountability. And we're going to start with strategies for managers. Now, I know not all of you may be managers on this call, but that's okay because we're going to go through some different options here. So, how can we, with all of this in mind, really think about creating an inclusive workplace where accountability isn't just about checking the box? So, let's review a couple different strategies that are going to allow us and help us align accountability with fairness and inclusivity. So, before we even get into anything, I do want to mention really quickly the platinum rule. Now, let's do a quick check-in for you. Who here has heard of the platinum rule, uses it, or is familiar with it? If you are familiar or have heard of the platinum rule, put a plus or a one in the chat. If this is something that you're not that familiar with or you're not sure what it means, put a zero or a dash in the chat. So let's take a moment. I'd love to see my chat popping off here. So, all right. Oh my gosh, so much stuff coming through. So lots of zeros. I see one plus so far. Um, two pluses, but a lot of zeros. Okay, so keep it coming if you're like, yes, I'm still thinking through and I want to share. But I think overall, there's definitely a bunch of you who are not that familiar with the platinum rule. Now, some of us might be more familiar with the golden rule, which, especially in the United States, I feel like is taught at very early ages in the school system. But the platinum rule takes the golden rule one step further. So the golden rule is treat others how you would want to be treated. And that's probably familiar for a lot of us on this call. The platinum rule is treat others how they want to be treated, not as how you want to be treated, but how they want to be treated. And the reason I love the platinum rule and why I'm sharing that as part of this whole discussion is because part of being accountable and part of thinking about how are we trying to build in this lens of inclusivity and support at an organizational level, at a management level, at an individual level, is we have to remember that we are not all the same and we don't all have the same workplace experiences. We don't all work the same. And what might work for me or what might look like accountability for me may not be the same for somebody else. And so if we're trying to help our team members be more accountable, it might not always be the same strategy for one person versus the other. And as I see in chat, yes, we do not all learn the same. So our brains are all very, very different in a lot of different ways. So platinum rule is a great thing to just keep in mind in the back of your head as you're thinking about just managing in general, working with colleagues in general, and as I go through these strategies. So let's go through them pretty quickly here. So we've got set clear expectations. So you want to make sure that your team your direct reports, your team members, they understand what they're supposed to be doing. They understand what their role is, what their tasks are. If you need to provide written documentation, this is where you do that. Make it really, really clear that you know and they know what it is that they're supposed to be doing. Clarify deadlines. Sometimes we say, "Hey, can you get this project to me by next week?" And your team member might think, "Great." For them, what does next week mean? Does it mean next Friday 5 p.m.? Does it mean next Tuesday at 10 a.m.? It might mean for you next Monday at 9 a.m. Make sure you're being really clear about what it is that you're asking for and what it is that you're discussing. Be explicit about those timelines, the deliverables, and also sometimes it's helpful to explain the impact of the work on the team because as managers, we have a different viewpoint into our projects, into how we're working than our direct reports. We have that more sort of holistic, high level view. And so sometimes for our direct reports, they may not understand why we have a deadline at 9 a.m. on Monday versus 5 p.m. on Friday. But there's other factors that they're not always privy to. So being helpful and clear about what the impact is or why it is that you're asking for something. Collaborate on your goals as well. So you can work with your team members to set goals that feel achievable for both of you, not just set a goal that might work for you, but may not work for them. Skill building is another really big piece of this too. And as a manager, this should be part of your thought process as you're thinking about supporting your team members. So, time management is usually a big issue that comes up when we talk about accountability. So, offer resources, training sessions, ideas on how people can prioritize and manage their time. Sometimes this might involve you providing that prioritization list to your team members as opposed to them setting the priorities. Because again, you have a different viewpoint in terms of the overall work picture than your direct reports may have. So for them, their priorities may be different and might not align with how you're trying to manage everything. Decision-making frameworks are also really, really helpful. So we'll talk a bit more about this when I talk about some tools, but there's different frameworks that you can provide, such as an Eisenhower or delegation matrix that will help people prioritize tasks effectively. And I'll talk more about that later on. Problem solving. So encourage your team members to problem solve on their own before they come to you so they get some of that practice. Now, again, you don't want people to just be spinning their wheels if they run into an issue or they're not sure or they get stuck, but encourage your team members to take an active role in thinking about how are they going to fix a problem or how are they going to deal with a challenge before they come to you so that that way it's actually going to help us shift into this idea of fostering ownership. And so the first thing here is something that I have found to be supremely helpful in my own experience, which is asking my reports what they think before I tell them what I think. It's really simple, but it's really effective. So instead of saying, here's what I would do, I like to start with saying, what do you think we should do? And so that kind of puts a little bit of the onus on them, and it also allows them more of a voice. So it lets them propose a solution or a plan instead of us dictating what the steps should be. Because again, remember the platinum rule, we don't always approach things in the same way. And I can't tell you how many times I've had team members offer something to me that I would have never thought about, but it's great because if I didn't ask them what they thought, then we'd only be going through things from my lens. And while I think I'm pretty smart, I have a very specific, unique lens, and it's not everyone's approach and not everyone's way of doing work. You can start to gradually reduce your reminders and check-ins. So that way, again, you're really shifting the focus of the ownership over to your team members. And again, positive reinforcement, positive recognition, especially when folks are taking initiative without prompting or meeting their deadlines or whatever it is that you're working with your team members on, that is going to be really helpful to continue that work. Now, feedback, constructive feedback, self-reflection, you want to be direct, you want to be empathetic. You can highlight the consequences of why something might not be working. So, for example, you could say to your team member something like, when I have to keep reminding you about this deadline, it's going to really impact your timeline. So let's work on how you can take more ownership of this project. You can ask reflective questions. So after a project, you could ask something like, what worked well for you in this project? Or what would you do differently next time? So you're asking folks to really think about this from their perspective as opposed to just looking for your perspective. And appropriate growth plans. What I mean by this is you want to be making sure that you're developing a growth plan for your team members, but you want to make sure that it aligns with their goals and what their hopes are. Because, for example, let's say that you are managing a multi-generational team and you might have someone who's a bit older on your team. They might not be looking to progress in their career in the same way that someone who's right out of higher education, university, college, whatever that might be looking to progress in their career. So make sure that your growth plan is appropriate and don't just use a one size fits all for everybody. Now, let's shift again to individuals. I'm going to go through this and then we'll have some time for some Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, just planting the seed here. Please feel to start seeding those in the chat, or you can also wait till we get towards the end and we'll go through those. But for individuals, clear communication, big one. So build trust through providing updates. You can keep others informed about your progress, especially if there's a delay. Now, again, this is going to look different for each of us. It could be sharing in a shared chat channel. It could be a weekly email. If you have a regular one-on-one with your manager or a leader, it could be including that in an agenda, but keeping others informed about what's going on. Ask questions. If you're not sure what's going on, ask. And again, remember that this is where you want to make sure that you fully understand what's going on and what's happening, as opposed to assuming or just spinning your wheels if you're getting stuck on something. So if it's unclear, if you're not sure what you should be doing, ask. If you need to, say no. Now, what I mean by this is sometimes we want to show that we're engaged. We want to show that we're committed, that we, like this job or need this job, or that we want to help. But we don't want to overcommit because that's where we go into the slide of making promises and then we're not always able to keep them, which doesn't get at this idea of accountability. So avoid overcommitting by recognizing the reality of what your limits are and working yourself to manage your workload effectively. And sometimes that means saying no and practicing that. And again, that can be hard for some of us. Tracking your own progress. So, as an individual, again, hopefully you have some support from your manager, your team lead, your team, your organization, but you can also hold yourself accountable. So, don't just rely on somebody else to do this for you. Set consequences. So, you could set a personal reward or a personal penalty if you meet or if you miss a deadline. Um, it could be, hey, if I get this deadline done on time, then I'm going to, you know, I don't know, it could be anything. Go for a long walk. I'll go and buy myself a fun drink at the coffee shop, whatever it might be for you. You can find an accountability partner. So work with a peer or a mentor to check in on your goals and progress, who's not necessarily someone that you directly report into, and document your commitment. So write down what you've committed to, write down what you've achieved, write down what you've learned, and review that pretty regularly. All right. Finally, cultivate growth mindset. Now, I know a lot of people talk about growth mindset, so I'm not going to get too deep into this because I feel like it's something that's kind of out there, and there's a lot of folks who talk about this in various different ways. But why I'm bringing it up here is thinking about how can we continuously grow ourselves. So look for learning opportunities, stay open, develop new skills, develop different perspectives. Think about feedback as a gift as opposed to a penalty. So, this is also a hard one because it does require, again, this growth mindset, this shift in how we're thinking about things. But I like to think about feedback, even when I hate it and I don't want to hear it or I don't agree with it. I think to myself, okay, this person is giving me a gift because they could have chosen not to give me this feedback at all. And then I would be, perhaps worse off. So, think about criticism, feedback, input as a tool for your growth rather than a setback. And celebrate your progress. So acknowledge those small and big wins to make sure that you're building momentum and confidence. Now, we don't have to do this alone, so there's a lot of different tools and resources out there. I'm just going to share a couple of my favorite tools for you. These are not an end all be all list, and you may have other tools. And there's definitely lots of supports out there, but these are a couple that I really like myself. So the first one up here is Asana. This is where I use this for creating, tracking all my tasks. I refer to this as my second brain. If it doesn't live in Asana, it's not in my brain. So that's a really great tool that I use along with my team to help make sure that we're all accountable to each other. This next one here in the middle is more of a time management tool, and this is Clockify that I love to use. It's something that's you can use it. It's a free or paid instance where it's basically a time tracking tool. There's other options out there as well. You can track your hours worked against a task or project, and it's really great, especially if you're a data person, a data nerd, to think about and dig into how much time are you spending on certain things and where do you spend your time and what does that look like. It can be really helpful for goal alignment and time management. You could also use Google Calendar or Outlook, and so that's where you can have a reminder for a task or deadline. I like to use my calendar where I schedule out blocks of time to work on what I call deep thought work, where I really need to be focused and not distracted by notifications. I want to be thinking, reading, getting deep into something. And it can also be a great way to share team accountability by sharing calendars as well. I've talked a little bit already about Slack, which we use quite a bit at Inclusion Geeks, and that's a collaboration and communication tool. There are other tools out there as well. We also love to use Zoom, which is what we are using right now. And then Lattice is a feedback and performance tool. There's others out there too. There's Tiny Pulse, there's other options, but it's a great way if you have especially if a larger team to kind of keep on track and make sure that you are tracking goals, making sure that you are providing a place for feedback and performance management for your team. And then finally, these last two items here on the bottom, Let me know if you're familiar with the schedule send feature in Gmail. If you use Gmail, I love it. I just used it this morning. I use it all the time. It is great because I know that, again, this goes back to the platinum rule. What works for me doesn't always work for some other person. So I love to respond to emails right away, but sometimes I don't want to overwhelm the person that I'm responding to. So I do a quick little schedule send and make sure that it goes in a timely fashion, but it's not necessarily 10 seconds after someone emailed me. And then I mentioned already the Eisenhower matrix or the delegation matrix. That's a variation of what this image on the lower right-hand corner is. And this is a great way if you're looking for working with a team member or for yourself to think about essentially parsing out what you have on your to-do list or your task list to prioritize it. So you basically go through and you prioritize by urgent or less urgent, and important or less important. So in the top left-hand corner, it's urgent and important, which means you should do that right away. You should do it now to be the top priority for you. The top right-hand quadrant is less urgent but still important. So that's something where you want to schedule it out, but maybe it doesn't need to be done immediately, but it should be done this week. Bottom left-hand quadrant is delegate. So this is not that important, but still urgent. So this is where maybe you're going to delegate that task to somebody else because it needs to be done. It doesn't necessarily need to be done by you. And then finally, delete, my favorite. It's a task that's not urgent and not important. Let's get rid of it. Let's not talk about it anymore. So tons of different options as far as tools and whatnot. But what I'd love to do is first see if there's any other tools that you all would recommend. I see there's some chats in here, plus oneing the different tools. If there's any other tools that you would recommend, please feel free to put them in chat or Slido. But we've got about just over 10 minutes left, well, 13 minutes for some Q&A. So as folks are thinking about other tools, and I see there's a question or two in the chat, which we'll respond to for sure. Let's start shifting into Q&A because I have talked a lot today in this hour, but I want to hear some of your voices as well. So the way we're going to do this is I have some pre-submitted questions that you all sent in when you signed up for this webinar, and I'm happy to go through those and just answer the ones that make sense for us to go through together. But because we're here and it's live, we can also do a live Q&A too. So if you are interested in asking a question, please feel free to use the raise hand feature in the Zoom tools settings that are available to you, and I will call on you and we can unmute and go from there. All right, so give folks a moment to kind of think through. I'm going to take a quick second to look through and make sure there was no immediate questions. I saw there were some questions around tools. We got answers to that. Okay, so why don't I do this? Let me start off with a question that was pre-submitted, and then if anyone would like to ask a question in real time, either put it in the chat or raise your hand and I'll call on you, and then we'll go from there. So the first question, and I'm going to put this in the chat just so that folks can have a record of it and see it. So this is the first question that I'll answer. The question was, how do you empower direct reports who need a lot of reminders to take action on their own? Yes, this is a great question. Whenever this person, whoever you were, sent it in, I really was thinking about this a lot through the lens of my own experience, both as a manager and as an employee, an individual contributor. And so what I would say is try to get this person or these people involved and invested on their own. Now, that's tricky because that can take more time and energy on your part, and also it requires them to be willing and open to engage in that way. But it can be really worth it if you're able to create the space for this and if they're willing to work with you on this. So, this is where you can go back to that phrase that I shared earlier of saying something like, "What do you think?" and working with them as opposed to telling them what to do. I have found that in my experience, if there's been issues around people not necessarily getting what I've asked them to do, or they provided a deliverable that doesn't make sense, or if they need a lot of reminders to follow certain practices, the best way to start off with is through a lens of curiosity because they might be thinking about stuff in a different way that you're not actually thinking about in your own brain. And you also don't want to just leave it open and say, oh, they're thinking about it differently, but it's not really working, but we're all different. You still need to build in that accountability. So this is where you build in really clear expectations, really clear outlines, repercussions, and timelines. And this can be co-created with your employees. So that way it's not a surprise. They have agreed with you. And again, it's a way for you to try to bring them in and have them take a sense of that ownership as well. All right, so I see there's a couple other questions in chat, so I'll go to the chat next for the next question. So I see there's a question on any frameworks or prompts to help shape career goals. Yes, lots of options out there. And again, depending on your organization, the tools you're using, the people that you're working with, lots of different options. I will say that if you are able to use a tool like Lattice, which I mentioned earlier, that has a lot of pre-built in frameworks to help with, but tools are not always available to us. Maybe it's not worth it for our organization to invest in a tool like that. Or maybe we're not quite there yet. Maybe we're not big enough to really need that kind of a tool. So what I would say is there are, certainly lots of different schools of thought here, but what I would start off with is just asking your employee what their career goals are. And that might sound really simple, but we sometimes skip over it. So ask them what do they want? What do they think? Now, they might say to you, I don't know. And that's okay because they might be really early in their career. Maybe they're new to your organization. Maybe they've never really thought about it before. So that opens the door for you to have more of a conversation because ideally in your role, if you're in a managerial role, you will have a bit of that broader sense and scope of what's possible. And it might be that their career might end up taking them outside of your organization. And so that's okay too, because as part of your role as a manager, I always like to think that it's my job to develop my employees for whatever's going to come next, even if that means that it's getting them ready to ultimately exit from the organization. So just start with asking them. All right, I got a couple other questions in the chat here. So any advice on managing up accountability? Yeah, that's going to be a little bit trickier because managing up is always trickier than just doing it ourselves. So let's see. Off the top of my head, I would say if you're trying to influence or manage up senior leadership or someone who's in a position above you in terms of hierarchy or power, data is a great way to convince people or to present them with options like this. And so I would say providing a leadership team or leaders or managers above you with data on how accountability might link to organizational success. So, looking at your KPIs, looking at how this might improve team performance, even if you're able to implement some of this stuff on your own, sharing that as a story or an update or, um, you know, a progress report to these team leads so that they can start to see how this might look in action and then provide that input. But it's going to be a little bit tricky because this will also depend on, again, that trust and that relationships that you may or may not have in place already with these folks. You could also highlight team success. You could highlight leadership strengths and talk about how this is a leadership strength that's helped you. So that's what I would try to start doing is really using yourself as a model to showcase possibilities to folks above you. All right. I want to take a quick second to see. I don't see any raised hands still, so I'm going to keep going through chat. So feel free to keep the questions coming. All right. So next question is, how do you navigate accountability as middle management in an environment where things are constantly shifting? I find I've often struggled with how to navigate when myself and my direct reports have set clear goals or priorities that we're working towards, and then organizational context or goals shift. So it's kind of all a moot point. It's hard not to say I don't like this and have any control over it either. It's just the way it is. Totally feel that. How can we be accountable for organization decisions by higher ups that we haven't had direct control in or decision-making power over? Ooh, that is a meaty question, Amy. Thank you for sharing. It's tricky, right? It is tricky because this is sort of the lot of a middle manager, right? You're so critical because you're taking in that information from top down and you're disseminating it to your direct reports, and you're kind of this like layer where things can either stop at you or they can continue on. I always like to think about umbrellas, especially, or I like to think about managers as umbrellas, especially if you're in this sort of middle layer here. But you're not always in those positions of power where you're determining things, or you may not be part of those conversations where things are shifting. So I do think that, again, being transparent and to your point, saying, hey, I don't like this either, but here's where we are, depending on, again, your organization, your culture, your leadership style, that might be the best way to approach it. But, again, this would be where I would say if it's a repeat pattern of behavior or a repeat pattern that's happening with your organization, it might be worth it to have that sort of managing up discussion with your manager, your leader, your C-suite, whatever that might look like for you, and say, hey, this is really tricky when, you told us this 2 weeks ago and now we're over here. And, employees are not responding well to this. And so I would say, again, just try to be as transparent as possible and try to be open while acknowledging, especially to your direct reports, that we don't always have all the answers and that sometimes this is out of our control as well. If other folks have any other ideas for Amy on this one, please feel free to put that in the chat too, because that one's a tough one, and I want to noodle on that a little bit more myself. Good question, Amy. Okay, let me see what else we have in here. We got one or two other questions. A big question, the eternal question. Okay. Someone's mentioned the smarter framework. I love the smarter framework as well. And I love, if anyone's familiar, the SMART framework has been out there for many, many years. The smarter framework kind of develops it a little bit further. So that's a great one too. Thanks for sharing that one. All right. Let's see where we are on time and where we are on questions. All right. Rachel, if I've missed any questions in chat, please let me know because I know it's been shifting around a little bit, but we are almost towards the end of our time. Any final questions from folks at this point? All right. We have maybe 2 or 3 minutes left. So let me take a quick look at the questions that were pre-submitted because there were definitely a few of those. Let me see if there's any burning questions that haven't been discussed quite just yet before we start wrapping up. Okay. So. Oh, there was a question that was submitted that I thought was really interesting that asked, how does accountability connect to restoration and repair? I love that question because I think that accountability is such a really critical concept for restorative justice. And if anyone's in the education space, especially, I know that this idea is talked about and practiced quite a bit in those spaces, but not necessarily in more corporate spaces. But really, accountability is around acknowledging harm and trying to repair it. So I think it's such a key piece of restorative work if you are engaged in that kind of work. But we have 2 minutes left. So again, if there's other questions that come up, please feel free to reach out to us afterwards. We are here for you. I'm happy to look at questions and think through them as well. But let's start wrapping up before we all head out. So we have some other webinars coming up. There's also a big QR code on the screen right now. So if you have a chance, please grab that QR code. We would love to hear your feedback so that we can be accountable around the work that we are doing. Like I said, we welcome feedback as a gift. So please feel free to give us your feedback. If you're not able to do that right now, we will be following up with a link to the recording with other resources. I will share out that list of comments and phrases and statements and everything that we've co-created together today as well. We have two webinars coming up in the immediate future. So we have another one coming up at the end of February, which is going to be reflections on race in the workplace on February 20th. We also have a webinar in March around building a better future for women at work, which will be held on March 19th. And there's more to come. We just don't want to overwhelm you all, but we are planning a lot more resources and things out there. So thank you so much for being here with us today. We are so delighted to have you all in the community with us. And one other quick shout out I will mention is we do have a podcast as well. So feel free to listen to our podcast. We are just getting into our new season, so that'll be coming out soon. And then if there are any other follow-up questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to us at facilitators@inclusiongeeks.com. Thank you so much, everyone. We are just at the hour, so I appreciate you spending your time with us today.